Washington, D.C. is engulfed in unprecedented political turmoil as former President Donald Trump unleashes a furious response to a formal congressional resolution demanding his resignation from all public office, a move that has plunged the Capitol into chaos and raised profound questions about the stability of American democracy. The resolution, introduced by a bipartisan coalition in the House of Representatives, cites a cascade of legal and ethical controversies surrounding Trump, from ongoing criminal cases to allegations of incitement and abuse of power. Trump's reaction, characterized by aides as volcanic, has been disseminated through his social media platform and in blistering statements to supporters, accusing Congress of orchestrating a coup and vowing to fight what he calls the corrupt political establishment. This confrontation marks a new nadir in the already deep divisions between Trump's faction of the Republican Party and the traditional governing institutions, with veteran political commentator George Will describing the situation as the most dangerous constitutional crisis since the Civil War. The chain of events began early this week when moderate Republicans, long silent but increasingly alarmed by the former president's influence, joined with unified Democrats to draft the resignation demand. The resolution itself is symbolic, lacking direct legal force, but its political weight is immense. It passed the House Judiciary Committee after a marathon session filled with heated debate, with final floor votes scheduled for tomorrow. The text alleges that Trump's conduct, both during his presidency and in the years since, has irreparably harmed the dignity of the office, undermined the rule of law, and represents a clear and present danger to the peaceful transfer of power. Specifically, it references the January 6th insurrection, his attempts to overturn the 2020 election, his handling of classified documents, and his recent convictions in New York on business fraud charges. The move is unprecedented. While Congress has impeached presidents before, it has never demanded the resignation of a former president who is now a private citizen, albeit one leading in polls for the Republican nomination. Trump's explosion was immediate and multifaceted. From his Mar-a-Lago estate, he released a video lasting over 20 minutes, a rant that lashed out at Speaker of the House, the Justice Department, and even members of his own party. "They are not after me, they are after you," he declared, framing the action as an attack on his millions of supporters. His legal team simultaneously filed a series of motions challenging the legitimacy of the resolution and threatening lawsuits against individual lawmakers for defamation. Meanwhile, his campaign apparatus shifted into high gear, fundraising off the witch hunt and organizing rallies scheduled for the coming weekend, events that authorities fear could turn violent. The Secret Service has reportedly heightened security around congressional leaders, and the Capitol Police have reinstated perimeter fencing, a grim reminder of the violence that shattered the building 2 years ago. How this happened is a story of boiling pressures finally reaching a tipping point. For months, a group of center-right lawmakers, influenced by the writings and public stance of conservative intellectual George Will, have been privately discussing the need for a definitive break from Trumpism. Will's columns, which have evolved from critical to openly calling for Trump's removal from the political stage, provided intellectual cover for action. The final catalyst appears to have been Trump's recent verbal attacks on the husband of a senior Republican senator, coupled with new revelations in the federal election interference case. These events galvanized the hesitant. The procedural machinery was set in motion by House Democrats, who saw an opportunity to force Republicans into a public choice. The bipartisan coalition, though slim, proved just enough to advance the resolution, with every Democrat and a handful of Republicans voting in favor. The global implications are already reverberating. Allies and adversaries alike are watching with a mixture of alarm and fascination. For nations that rely on American leadership, the chaos in Washington signals a potentially prolonged period of uncertainty in U.S. foreign policy. Key issues like support for Ukraine, strategic competition with China, and stability in the Middle East may be sidelined or subject to wild swings depending on the domestic political outcome. In European capitals, there is open concern about the resilience of American institutions. "We are witnessing the unthinkable," said one senior NATO diplomat on condition of anonymity. The idea that a former president is being asked to resign by Congress, and his response is to rally his followers against the government, is something we associate with fragile democracies, not the United States. In Moscow and Beijing, state media are gleefully amplifying the discord, portraying it as evidence of Western democratic decay and hypocrisy. Historically, this moment finds echoes in the Watergate scandal and the resignation of President Richard Nixon. However, analysts are quick to point out critical differences. Nixon faced impeachment proceedings for clear abuses of power, but the political pressure came from within his own party, leading to a graceful exit. Today, the Republican Party remains largely enthralled to Trump, with only a minority breaking ranks. The demand for resignation targets a former president, not a sitting one, complicating the constitutional framework. Furthermore, the media landscape and the role of social media have created information ecosystems where facts are contested and partisan anger is easily fueled. The political scientist Julia Azari notes, this is not 1974. The norms that forced Nixon out have been eroding for decades. We are in uncharted territory where the very idea of a shared reality is under assault. The political implications are vast and terrifying for both parties. For Republicans, this is a moment of existential crisis. The party is now openly split between a Trump-led populist wing and a diminished traditional conservative bloc. Primary challenges are being announced against those Republicans who supported the resolution, guaranteeing bloody intra-party battles that could leave the GOP weakened for the 2024 election cycle. For Democrats, there is no clear victory path either. While they have succeeded in isolating Trump formally, they risk galvanizing his base and turning him into a martyr. Moreover, the Democratic leadership must now manage the process without appearing overzealous, lest they be accused of political persecution. The Biden White House has maintained a studied silence, with officials stating only that the president respects the independence of the legislative branch, but behind the scenes, there is acute anxiety about the nation tipping into widespread civil unrest. Economically, the turmoil has injected severe volatility into financial markets. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell over 800 points in afternoon trading, and the VIX Volatility Index, often called the fear gauge, spiked to its highest level since the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. Investors are fleeing to safe haven assets like Treasury bonds and gold. The uncertainty threatens to undermine consumer confidence, just as the Federal Reserve is grappling with inflation. Business leaders, through groups like the Business Roundtable, have issued cautious statements calling for calm and a swift resolution, but the prospect of prolonged political paralysis is leading to forecasts of reduced investment and hiring. The dollar has weakened against major currencies, and oil prices have jumped due to concerns about instability in a major consuming nation. The economic impact, if the crisis persists, could tip a fragile economy into recession. Socially, the nation is bracing for further division. Polls show a stark partisan split. Over 80% of Republicans view the congressional action as illegitimate, while a similar majority of Democrats support it. Independent voters are more evenly divided, but with a significant portion expressing exhaustion and disgust with both sides. On social media, trending topics are dominated by hashtags like #ResignNow and #StandWithTrump. Law enforcement agencies at the federal and state levels are monitoring online chatter for threats of violence. Civil rights organizations have warned that the rhetoric could spill over into attacks on political opponents or institutions. The fabric of communities is being tested, with reports of heated arguments among family and friends, and local government meetings being disrupted by protesters. The American experiment, built on a foundation of peaceful political conflict resolution, is facing perhaps its most severe stress test in modern memory. International reactions are varied but uniformly concerned. Close allies like the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan have made diplomatic inquiries but are refraining from public comment, adhering to the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs. However, behind closed doors, ambassadors are seeking briefings from the State Department. In contrast, nations like Hungary and Poland, with governments sympathetic to Trump's populism, have criticized the Congress move as undemocratic. From the United Nations, the Secretary General issued a generic plea for all nations to uphold democratic norms and stability. More telling are the actions of strategic rivals. Russia has convened an emergency session of its Security Council, likely to explore opportunities to exploit U.S. distraction. China's foreign ministry, in a carefully worded statement, said, hopes the U.S. can manage its own affairs properly and maintain world peace, a comment widely interpreted as smug disdain. The global order, already under strain from war and economic rivalry, now faces an added layer of unpredictability from its traditional anchor. Expert analysis paints a grim picture of the days ahead. Constitutional scholars are debating the precedents and powers at play. While Congress cannot force a private citizen to resign, its power of the purse and oversight capabilities give it substantial leverage. Some experts suggest that the resolution could be a prelude to more concrete actions, such as censure or even the revival of impeachment proceedings for actions after leaving office, though that is a legal gray area. Political strategists from both sides agree that Trump's response will determine the trajectory. If he continues to escalate, calling for protests and undermining trust in elections, the country could see repeated episodes of violence. If he unexpectedly complies, though considered unlikely, it would mark a stunning end to his political career. Historians like Michael Beschloss warn that the nation is in a pre-revolutionary atmosphere where the institutions are struggling to contain the passions of the populace. The coming weeks will be critical, with the House vote, Trump's rally schedule, and the slow grind of the justice system all converging into a perfect storm. What could happen next is outlined by several clear benchmarks. The House will hold its vote, which is expected to pass along party lines with a handful of Republican defections. Trump will hold his planned rallies, where his rhetoric will be scrutinized for incitement. The Justice Department, already prosecuting Trump on multiple fronts, may face increased pressure to accelerate cases or, conversely, to pause them for fear of appearing political. State-level investigations in Georgia and elsewhere will continue independently. The Republican National Committee will meet to discuss party rules, potentially moving to sanction members who voted for the resolution. Meanwhile, the Biden administration must decide whether to use the bully pulpit to calm the nation or remain detached. The military leadership has reiterated its commitment to civilian control and the Constitution, a necessary reassurance in such times. The path forward is fraught, with every action carrying the risk of escalation. This is a developing story, and the sense of crisis is palpable from the halls of Congress to the town squares of Middle America. The demand for a former president's resignation, a step never before taken, coupled with that president's furious refusal, has created a standoff with no clear resolution mechanism. As George Will wrote in his latest column, "The Republic is undergoing a fever. It will either break the fever or succumb to it. The coming days will test the resilience of every American institution, from the courts to the press to the electorate itself. The world watches, aware that the outcome will resonate far beyond U.S. borders, shaping the geopolitical landscape for years to come." The immediate aftermath of the House Judiciary Committee vote has seen a rapid mobilization of both protest and counter-protest movements across the country. In major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, demonstrations have drawn thousands, with police deploying in large numbers to keep opposing groups apart. There have been isolated incidents of vandalism and clashes, but so far, widespread violence has been averted. However, the atmosphere remains charged, with social media platforms struggling to contain misinformation and calls for armed mobilization. The Department of Homeland Security has issued a National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin warning of the potential for lone wolf attacks targeting political figures or government facilities. This security posture underscores the palpable fear that the political rhetoric could translate into real-world harm. Delving deeper into the historical background, the United States has faced presidential crises before, but each with distinct characteristics. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868 centered on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act during Reconstruction, a clash over executive power and post-Civil War policy. The Watergate scandal, leading to Nixon's resignation in 1974, involved a bipartisan consensus that executive misconduct required accountability, bolstered by a press corps that operated with relative public trust. The impeachments of Bill Clinton and Donald Trump twice were highly partisan affairs, but none precipitated a demand for resignation after leaving office. The current situation is unique because it targets a former president who is actively seeking a return to power, blurring the lines between past misconduct and future candidacy. This ambiguity challenges the constitutional remedies available, as the framers did not anticipate a scenario where a former official would retain such a powerful political foothold. Legal experts point to the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which disqualifies from office those who engaged in insurrection, as a possible legal avenue, but its application requires judicial determination, not congressional resolution. Thus, the resignation demand is purely political, aiming to isolate Trump morally and strategically. The political implications extend beyond the two-party system to state and local governance. Several Republican-led state legislatures have announced investigations into the congressional resolution, framing it as federal overreach. In states like Florida and Texas, governors have issued statements supporting Trump and condemning what they call a politically motivated witch hunt. This sets the stage for conflicts between federal and state authorities, reminiscent of the nullification crises of the 19th century. Meanwhile, Democratic-controlled states are considering measures to bar Trump from ballots under the 14th Amendment, a move that would likely end up at the Supreme Court. The judicial branch now finds itself at the center of the storm, with multiple cases involving Trump potentially reaching the high court in the coming months. The Supreme Court's composition, with a conservative majority, includes 3 justices appointed by Trump, raising questions about recusals and perceived impartiality. The credibility of the judiciary as a neutral arbiter is on the line, and its decisions could either diffuse or escalate the crisis. Economically, the ripple effects are becoming more pronounced. Beyond the stock market swings, the bond market is signaling stress, with yields on long-term treasuries rising as investors demand higher returns for uncertainty. The credit rating agency Moody's has placed the United States AAA rating on review for possible downgrade, citing political instability that undermines fiscal policymaking. A downgrade would increase borrowing costs for the government, corporations, and consumers, further straining the economy. The business community is divided. While some CEOs are quietly urging a resolution to restore stability, others, particularly in media and technology, are facing pressure from employees and shareholders to take stands. Advertising boycotts have emerged on platforms perceived as hosting extremist content, and there are calls for businesses to suspend political donations to lawmakers who support or oppose Trump. The tourism industry in Washington, D.C. is bracing for a downturn as security zones expand and protests deter visitors. Internationally, trade partners are beginning to hedge their bets, with the European Union fast-tracking talks on reducing dependency on the U.S. dollar, and Asian markets exploring alternative supply chains that bypass American political risk. Social consequences are manifesting in demographic and generational shifts. Younger voters, according to polling data, are expressing heightened cynicism about the political system, with many questioning whether democracy can address their concerns. Voter registration drives are seeing surges, but also increased harassment at registration sites. Educational institutions are grappling with how to teach current events, with school boards reporting conflicts over curriculum related to January 6th and Trump's presidency. Mental health professionals note a rise in anxiety and stress-related symptoms linked to political news consumption, a phenomenon sometimes called election stress disorder that now seems perpetual. Community organizations that bridge partisan divides, like religious groups and civic associations, are reporting strained relations and drop-offs in participation. The very social capital that democracy relies upon, trust, reciprocity, and shared norms, is being depleted, making collective action on other pressing issues like climate change or public health more difficult. International reactions are now moving from statements to tangible policy adjustments. In Europe, France and Germany are reportedly discussing a contingency plan for NATO should U.S. commitment waver, including increased defense spending and coordinated strategic autonomy. In Asia, Japan and South Korea are holding emergency security consultations, fearful that North Korea or China might test alliances during U.S. distraction. Taiwan has raised its alert level, concerned about heightened Chinese military activity. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran are both reassessing their diplomatic approaches, with Saudi officials privately expressing worry about the reliability of U.S. security guarantees. Israel's government, which had close ties with the Trump administration, is now cautiously engaging with the Biden White House while monitoring the internal U.S. situation. Russia, beyond propaganda efforts, is suspected of amplifying cyber operations to sow further discord, according to U.S. intelligence briefings. China, meanwhile, is accelerating its efforts to present an alternative model of governance, hosting diplomatic forums that emphasize stability and development without political strife. The global shift toward multipolarity, long discussed, is gaining momentum from Washington's chaos. Expert-level analysis from a range of disciplines offers no consensus on the outcome but agrees on the severity. Historians like Timothy Snyder draw parallels to the fall of the Roman Republic, where personal loyalty to charismatic leaders eroded Republican institutions. Political scientists such as Stephen Levitsky, co-author of How Democracies Die, argue that the guardrails are failing because one major party has abandoned its commitment to democratic rules. Legal scholars debate whether Congress could invoke its contempt powers or other sanctions to enforce moral suasion, but most concede that without judicial enforcement, the resolution is a political tool. Psychologists studying Trump's base note, the deep-seated grievances and identity politics that make his supporters resistant to conventional political pressure. Economists warn of stagflation if policy uncertainty persists, combining high inflation with low growth. Security experts fear that domestic extremism, fueled by the narrative of a stolen political destiny, could lead to sustained low-level conflict. The interplay of these factors creates a complex system where a trigger event, a violent incident, a dramatic legal ruling, or an inflammatory speech could spiral the situation beyond control. What could happen next, without speculation, involves observing the scheduled events and legal deadlines. The House vote will occur, and its passage is assured. Trump's rallies this weekend will be a key indicator of his tone and the crowd's reaction. The Justice Department's special counsel, Jack Smith, has a trial date set for March in the election interference case, but motions to delay are pending. The Supreme Court is scheduled to hear a case next month on presidential immunity, which could directly impact Trump's defenses. The Republican primaries begin with the Iowa caucuses in January, and Trump's eligibility may be challenged in multiple states. The Biden administration will likely give a national address if violence erupts, but their options are limited by the desire to avoid appearing partisan. International summits, like the G7 in June, will become forums where allies seek reassurance. Each of these events is a potential flashpoint, and their outcomes will shape the trajectory of the crisis. The only certainty is that the pressure will not abate soon, and the institutions designed to manage conflict are being tested to their limits. As the situation evolves, the world remains fixed on Washington, where the chaos sparked by a congressional demand and a former president's fury continues to spiral with no end in sight. The immediate aftermath of the House Judiciary Committee vote has seen a rapid mobilization of both protest and counter-protest movements across the country. In major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, demonstrations have drawn thousands, with police deploying in large numbers to keep opposing groups apart. There have been isolated incidents of vandalism and clashes, but so far, widespread violence has been averted. However, the atmosphere remains charged, with social media platforms struggling to contain misinformation and calls for armed mobilization. The Department of Homeland Security has issued a National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin warning of the potential for lone wolf attacks targeting political figures or government facilities. This security posture underscores the palpable fear that the political rhetoric could translate into real-world harm, transforming a political crisis into a security emergency. The Capitol Police, still scarred by the events of January 6th, have initiated a zero-tolerance policy for unauthorized gatherings, a move that itself has become a political flashpoint, criticized by some as the militarization of public dissent. Delving deeper into the historical background, the United States has faced presidential crises before, but each with distinct characteristics. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868 centered on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act during Reconstruction, a clash over executive power and post-Civil War policy. The Watergate scandal leading to Nixon's resignation in 1974 involved a bipartisan consensus that executive misconduct required accountability, bolstered by a press corps that operated with relative public trust. The impeachments of Bill Clinton and Donald Trump twice were highly partisan affairs, but none precipitated a demand for resignation after leaving office. The current situation is unique because it targets a former president who is actively seeking a return to power, blurring the lines between past misconduct and future candidacy. This ambiguity challenges the constitutional remedies available, as the framers did not anticipate a scenario where a former official would retain such a powerful political foothold. Legal experts point to the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which disqualifies from office those who engaged in insurrection as a possible legal avenue, but its application requires judicial determination, not congressional resolution. Thus, the resignation demand is a political weapon aiming to isolate Trump morally and strategically within his own party, and to the broader electorate, a gambit with high risk and uncertain reward. The political implications extend beyond the two-party system to state and local governance, creating a fractal pattern of conflict. Several Republican-led state legislatures, notably in Texas, Florida, and Ohio, have announced symbolic resolutions condemning the congressional action and launching their own investigations into what they term federal overreach and election interference. This sets the stage for conflicts between federal and state authorities, reminiscent of the nullification crises of the 19th century but fought in modern courts and on cable news. Meanwhile, Democratic-controlled states like California, New York, and Illinois are accelerating measures to bar Trump from their ballots under the 14th Amendment, a move that would likely trigger a swift appeal to the Supreme Court. The judicial branch now finds itself at the center of the storm, with multiple cases involving Trump potentially reaching the High Court in the coming months. The Supreme Court's composition, with a 6-3 conservative majority that includes 3 justices appointed by Trump, raises profound questions about recusals and perceived impartiality. The credibility of the judiciary as a neutral arbiter is on the line, and its decisions in the coming weeks on issues like presidential immunity and the insurrection clause could either diffuse the crisis or pour gasoline on the fire, making the court an active participant in the political fray rather than a detached referee. Economically, the ripple effects are becoming more pronounced and systemic. Beyond the stock market swings, the bond market is signaling deep stress, with yields on long-term treasuries rising as investors demand higher returns for heightened political risk. The credit rating agency Moody's has placed the United States Type-A rating on review for possible downgrade, citing an intensification of political polarization that is impeding foundational fiscal and debt policymaking. A downgrade would increase borrowing costs for the government, corporations, and consumers, further straining an economy already grappling with inflation. The business community is deeply divided and cautious. While some major CEOs are quietly urging a swift resolution to restore stability, others, particularly in the media and technology sectors, are facing intense pressure from employees and shareholders to take public stands. Advertising boycotts have emerged on platforms perceived as hosting extremist content or conversely censoring political speech. There are widespread calls for corporate political action committees to suspend donations to lawmakers on both sides of the conflict, threatening the financial lifeblood of congressional campaigns. The tourism and hospitality industry in Washington, D.C. is bracing for a severe downturn as expanded security zones and the specter of protests deter visitors. Internationally, trade partners are beginning to hedge their bets in tangible ways. The European Union is fast-tracking talks on reducing dependency on the U.S. dollar for energy transactions, and Asian markets are actively exploring alternative supply chains that bypass American political risk, signaling a long-term erosion of U.S. economic centrality. Social consequences are manifesting in corrosive demographic and generational shifts, tearing at the community fabric. Younger voters, according to contemporaneous polling data, are expressing heightened cynicism and disillusionment about the political system, with a significant majority questioning whether American democracy is capable of addressing fundamental concerns like climate change, student debt, and inequality. Voter registration drives are seeing record numbers, but also increased reports of harassment and intimidation at registration sites, particularly in swing states. Educational institutions from high schools to universities are grappling with how to teach current events, with school boards across the nation reporting intense conflicts over curriculum related to January 6th, Trump's presidency, and the nature of American history. Mental health professionals note a sharp rise in anxiety and stress-related symptoms linked to constant political news consumption, a phenomenon sometimes called election stress disorder that now appears to be a permanent feature of the national psyche. Community organizations that traditionally bridge partisan divides, like interfaith, religious groups, Rotary clubs, and civic associations, are reporting strained relations and significant drop-offs in participation. The very social capital that a functioning democracy relies upon, trust, reciprocity, and shared civic norms, is being rapidly depleted, making collective action on other pressing national issues like public health, infrastructure, and climate change increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to coordinate. International reactions are now moving from diplomatic statements to tangible policy adjustments and realignments, reshaping the global order in real time. In Europe, France and Germany are reportedly drafting a confidential contingency plan for NATO should U.S. commitment waver, focusing on increased European defense integration and strategic autonomy, a concept once theoretical, now gaining urgent practical momentum. In Asia, Japan and South Korea have held emergency security consultations, fearful that North Korea might conduct provocative missile tests or that China might increase pressure on Taiwan or in the South China Sea during a period of perceived U.S. distraction. Taiwan's defense ministry has quietly raised its alert level, and senior officials are conducting back-channel communications with U.S. counterparts seeking reassurance. In the Middle East, both traditional allies and adversaries are reassessing their diplomatic playbooks. Saudi Arabian officials are privately expressing deep concern about the reliability of U.S. security guarantees as they negotiate with China, while Iran sees an opportunity to advance its regional influence. Israel's government, which had exceptionally close ties with the Trump administration, is now engaged in a delicate balancing act, cautiously reaffirming its partnership with the Biden White House while closely monitoring the internal U.S. situation for any impact on military aid or policy. Russia, beyond its propaganda efforts, is suspected by U.S. Intelligence agencies of amplifying cyber operations and clandestine social media campaigns to sow further discord and undermine confidence in electoral processes ahead of November. China, meanwhile, is accelerating its efforts to present an alternative model of governance, hosting high-profile diplomatic forums that emphasize stability, development, and non-interference, directly contrasting itself with the chaotic spectacle in Washington. The global shift toward multipolarity, long discussed in academic and policy circles, is gaining decisive, irreversible momentum from Washington's self-inflicted chaos. Expert-level analysis from a range of disciplines offers no consensus on the outcome, but agrees unanimously on the severity and novel nature of the crisis. Historians like Timothy Snyder and Anne Applebaum draw sobering parallels to the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of 20th century authoritarianism, where personal loyalty to charismatic leaders systematically eroded Republican institutions and norms. Political scientists such as Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, co-authors of How Democracies Die, argue that the guardrails have failed precisely because one major political party has abandoned its commitment to democratic rules of the game, treating politics as a war for survival. Legal scholars are engaged in fierce debate over whether Congress possesses any latent guarantee clause power to protect states from insurrection, or if the judiciary alone can adjudicate disqualification. Psychologists studying Trump's base note the powerful role of deep-seated grievances, social identity threat, and media ecosystems that make his supporters largely impervious to conventional political pressure or factual correction. Economists from both Keynesian and classical schools warn of a potential return to 1972 style stagflation if policy uncertainty persists, combining high inflation with low growth and investment. National security and counterterrorism experts fear that domestic violent extremism, fueled by the potent narrative of a stolen political destiny and government tyranny, could escalate from isolated incidents to a sustained period of low-level conflict, challenging law enforcement capacities. The interplay of these factors creates a complex, nonlinear system where a single trigger event, a major violent incident, a dramatic and contested legal ruling, or an especially inflammatory speech could spiral the situation beyond the control of any institution. What could happen next, described without speculative language, involves observing the concrete sequence of scheduled events and legal deadlines that will define the coming weeks and months. The full House of Representatives will hold its final vote on the resolution, and its passage is a near certainty given the Democratic majority and confirmed Republican defections. The political fallout from that vote, including primary challenges and censure motions within the GOP, will begin immediately. Donald Trump's scheduled rallies in Michigan and Pennsylvania this weekend will be scrutinized millimeter by millimeter for his rhetorical tone, his specific directives to the crowd and the response from law enforcement and counter-protesters. The Justice Department's special counsel, Jack Smith, has a firm trial date set for March 4th in the federal election interference case, but a thicket of pending motions on immunity and procedural issues could delay it, a delay the prosecution will vigorously oppose. The Supreme Court, as mentioned, has agreed to hear arguments on the scope of presidential immunity, with a ruling expected by late June. State-level proceedings, particularly the Georgia racketeering case, continue on their own tracks, with pretrial motions creating daily headlines. The Republican presidential primary calendar officially begins with the Iowa caucuses in January, but challenges to Trump's eligibility under the 14th Amendment are pending in dozens of states, ensuring that secretaries of state and state courts will become battleground. The Biden administration will likely feel compelled to give a formal national address if significant violence erupts, but his options are constrained by the imperative to avoid appearing partisan or to elevate his likely opponent. International summits, most notably the G7 meeting in Italy in June and the NATO summit in Washington in July, will become fraught forums where allies will seek ironclad assurances and the world will judge the stability of American leadership. Each of these events is a potential flashpoint, a node of crisis that could alter the trajectory. The only certainty is that the pressure will not abate soon, and the institutions designed to manage political conflict, Congress, the courts, the press, the electoral system, are being tested to their absolute limits, with their weaknesses and vulnerabilities exposed as never before. As the situation evolves, the world remains fixed on Washington, where the chaos sparked by a congressional demand and a former president's fury continues its dangerous spiral, with no clear off-ramp in sight, and the very foundations of the republic undergoing a stress test whose results are terrifyingly unknown. The coming days will be measured not in legislative victories or polls, but in the maintenance of basic public order and the fragile, fraying belief in a shared democratic future.